There's a moment in every person's life when they realize that winning isn't about throwing the first punch or the loudest response. It's about knowing when to stay silent, when to observe, and when to strike with such precision that your opponent never sees it coming. This is the story of Marcus Chen, a man who learned the hardest way possible that emotional reactions create temporary satisfaction, but strategic retaliation builds empires. Marcus stood in his corner office on the 42nd floor, watching the city lights flicker below like scattered diamonds. His reflection in the glass looked older than his 38 years. The tie around his neck felt like a noose, and the champagne in his hand tasted bitter despite its expensive label. Just 6 hours ago, he had been fired from the company he helped build from nothing. 6 hours ago, his business partner David Richardson had stood before the board of directors and blamed Marcus for financial irregularities that David himself had orchestrated. 6 hours ago, Marcus's world had collapsed while David smiled and shook hands with investors who once called Marcus a visionary. The urge to call David, to scream, to threaten, to expose him immediately was overwhelming. Marcus's phone sat on his desk, and his fingers trembled with the desire to dial. Every muscle in his body wanted to react, to defend himself, to fight back right now. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was the memory of his grandfather's voice from years ago, telling him a story about a general who lost a war because he reacted to provocation instead of planning his response. Marcus had grown up in a modest neighborhood where his parents ran a small grocery store. His father worked 16-hour days. His mother managed the books, and together they saved every penny to send Marcus to business school. He had been the first in his family to graduate from university, the first to wear a suit to work, the first to dream beyond the four walls of that little store. When he met David Richardson at a networking event 12 years ago, it felt like destiny. David came from old money, had connections Marcus could only dream of, and together they created Richardson Chen Technologies, a software company that revolutionized inventory management systems for retail chains. For 10 years, they grew together. Marcus handled the technical side, the product development, the innovation that made their software indispensable. David managed relationships, investments, and expansion. They complemented each other perfectly, or so Marcus believed. The company grew from 2 men in a garage to 500 employees across 3 countries. Their software was used by major retailers worldwide. Success had come, and with it, Marcus had bought his parents a comfortable home and ensured they would never have to worry about money again. But success breeds jealousy, and David had always been uncomfortable sharing the spotlight. Marcus had noticed small things over the past year, meetings he wasn't invited to, decisions made without his input, David's tone becoming dismissive when Marcus spoke in front of investors. Marcus had ignored these signs, too focused on the next product launch, too busy believing that their friendship and partnership was unbreakable. The setup had been elaborate. David had spent months creating a paper trail that suggested Marcus was siphoning funds into offshore accounts. He had forged documents, manipulated financial reports, and even created fake email exchanges. When the board discovered these irregularities, David had played the shocked partner, the betrayed friend, the victim of Marcus's greed. The evidence was convincing because David had made it convincing. The board had no choice but to terminate Marcus immediately and launch an investigation. Marcus had stood in that boardroom, listening to accusations, watching David's performance and feeling his heart break in real time. The betrayal was complete. David hadn't just taken the company. He had stolen Marcus's reputation, his credibility, his dignity, and worst of all, he had done it so skillfully that defending himself made Marcus look guilty. Every protest seemed like a lie. Every explanation sounded like an excuse. Now, alone in this borrowed office, a friend had given him access to clear out some personal files. Marcus faced a choice. His instinct screamed for immediate action. He could call a press conference, hire lawyers, fight publicly, make noise, demand justice. He could post on social media, reach out to every contact, burn bridges and scorch earth. He could react with all the fury of a wronged man. But as he stood there, phone in hand, something his grandfather once said echoed in his mind. The old man had fought in the Korean War and survived not through aggression, but through patience. Marcus, he had said during one of their last conversations before he passed away, angry men are predictable men. Predictable men are dead men. When someone strikes you, don't strike back immediately. Watch them. Learn their patterns. Understand their weaknesses. Then, when they least expect it, when they think they've won. That's when you move. Marcus set down his phone. He took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. He would not react. He would not call lawyers tonight. He would not defend himself publicly. He would not give David the satisfaction of seeing him scramble and panic. Instead, he would disappear. He would let David think he had won completely. He would let the story play out exactly as David had written it. The next morning, Marcus's phone rang constantly. Journalists wanted statements. Former colleagues wanted explanations. Investors demanded answers. Marcus ignored every call. He changed his phone number and told only 3 people: his parents and his younger sister, Sarah, who worked as a corporate attorney in New York. Sarah was furious and wanted to fight immediately. But Marcus calmed her down. "Trust me," he told her. "I need you to do something for me, but you need to stay quiet about it." "Can you do that?" Sarah agreed, though reluctantly. Marcus gave her a list of documents he needed copied from the company servers before David could delete them. As the co-founder, Marcus still had access credentials that David probably hadn't thought to revoke immediately, assuming Marcus would be too distraught to think clearly. Sarah used her legal expertise to create official-looking requests and managed to obtain copies of financial records, email servers, and internal communications going back 3 years. While David celebrated his victory, Marcus disappeared from public view. Friends who tried to reach him found silence. Social media accounts went dark. Former employees received no responses. To the outside world, Marcus Chen had vanished, presumably destroyed by shame and defeat. David's narrative spread unchallenged. Articles appeared in trade publications about the scandal. Richardson Technologies' David had already dropped Chen from the name, released statements about moving forward with integrity and new leadership. Marcus rented a small apartment in a different part of the city, under a corporate name that couldn't be traced to him. He spent 18 hours a day going through the documents Sarah had obtained. He created spreadsheets, timelines, and connection maps. He studied every transaction, every email, every meeting note. The picture that emerged was even worse than he had imagined. David hadn't just framed Marcus for this one incident. He had been systematically positioning himself to take sole control for nearly 2 years. What Marcus discovered was a pattern. David had been slowly buying out smaller shareholders, convincing them that Marcus was difficult to work with. He had been feeding negative stories about Marcus to board members, always subtle, always deniable. He had been hiring loyalists and pushing out people who respected Marcus. The financial fraud was just the final move in a long campaign to remove Marcus from the company they had built together. But David had made mistakes. In his confidence, he had left trails. There were emails discussing the problem of Marcus with people outside the company. There were payment records to a consultant who specialized in corporate takeovers. There were inconsistencies in the forged documents that a careful analysis could expose. David had been thorough, but he hadn't been perfect, and Marcus was finding every imperfection. 3 weeks after his firing, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. James Morrison was a board member who had voted to terminate Marcus, but had always seemed uncomfortable about it. He appeared at Marcus's apartment. Sarah had given him the address, looking troubled and uncertain. "I'm probably making a mistake coming here," James said, standing in the doorway. "But something doesn't feel right about all this. I've known you for 8 years, Marcus. I've seen how you work. This doesn't match the person I thought you were." Marcus invited him in. He didn't show James the evidence he had been gathering. Instead, he asked questions. He let James talk. He listened as the board member described how David had been the one to discover the fraud, how convenient the timing had been, how quickly David had moved to restructure the company. James's own words were raising doubts in his mind, and Marcus simply guided the conversation, never pushing, never demanding. "What are you going to do?" James finally asked. "Are you going to fight this?" "I don't know yet," Marcus lied. "I'm still trying to understand what happened. But James, if you ever feel like the truth matters more than convenience, I'd appreciate you remembering this conversation." After James left, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. The seed of doubt had been planted. David's perfect narrative had its first crack. But Marcus didn't rush. He didn't call other board members. He didn't spread rumors or fight back. He continued his silent investigation, gathering more evidence, understanding more connections, building a complete picture of David's betrayal. Marcus also began researching David's next moves. He studied the company's public filings, tracked new hires, monitored press releases. David was planning a major acquisition, a merger with a European company that would triple Richardson Technologies' market value. The deal was complex and required board approval, investor confidence, and regulatory clearance. David was betting everything on this expansion, using it to cement his position as the sole visionary behind the company's success. 1 month after his firing, Marcus started making quiet moves. He reached out to a former employee, someone David had pushed out for being too loyal to Marcus. This employee now worked for a competing firm and was happy to share information about the industry. Marcus learned about other companies David had wronged, other business partners he had betrayed in smaller ways over the years. He discovered that David's reputation for ruthlessness was well known among certain circles, but people stayed quiet because David had power and connections. Marcus began building a network of people who had reasons to see David fail. He didn't reveal his ultimate plan. He simply reconnected, listened to their stories, and occasionally asked questions that made them think about their own experiences with David. He was creating a web of potential allies, people who might be useful when the time came to act. Meanwhile, David's confidence grew. At a major industry conference, he gave a keynote speech about innovation and integrity in business. He talked about difficult decisions and the importance of ethical leadership. He mentioned, without naming Marcus directly, the unfortunate situation where a co-founder had betrayed the company's trust. The audience applauded. David smiled. He believed he had won completely. Marcus watched the speech on a live stream from his small apartment. He felt no anger, no rage, no desire to interrupt or disrupt. Instead, he felt calm. He took notes on what David said, how he positioned himself, what promises he made. Every word was ammunition for later. Every boast was a potential vulnerability. Every claim of innocence was a rope David was weaving for himself. 2 months after his firing, Marcus made his first direct move. But it wasn't against David. He reached out to the European company that David was trying to acquire. Through a series of intermediary contacts, he arranged a private meeting with their CEO, Hans Müller. Marcus didn't present himself as a victim or a whistleblower. He presented himself as someone with information that might be relevant to Hans's due diligence process. "I'm not asking you to believe me," Marcus told Hans during their video call. "I'm simply suggesting that you verify everything David Richardson tells you. Look at how he treats partners. Examine his history with co-founders. Ask yourself if this is someone you want to be in business with for the next decade." Hans was skeptical but intrigued. "Why are you telling me this? If what David says about you is true, you have your own credibility problems." "That's exactly why you should investigate independently," Marcus replied. "Don't take David's word. Don't take my word. Look at the facts yourself. I'm simply suggesting you dig deeper before committing hundreds of millions of euros to a partnership." The meeting ended without commitments, but Marcus knew he had accomplished his goal. Hans would investigate. His team would ask harder questions. David's smooth acquisition process would hit complications, and David would never know why. As Marcus continued his silent campaign, he maintained his public invisibility. Friends who reached out received brief, deflated responses that suggested he was broken and defeated. Former colleagues who tried to defend him found no support from Marcus himself. To everyone watching, Marcus Chen had given up. He had accepted his fate. He had vanished in shame. 3 months had passed since Marcus's world collapsed, and during that time he had transformed himself from a reactive victim into a strategic operator. His apartment had become a command center, walls covered with timelines, connection maps, and evidence folders. Every morning, he woke at 5 and spent the first hour meditating, a practice his grandfather had taught him. Clarity came from stillness, not chaos. David Richardson was thriving, or so it appeared. The company's stock price had risen 15% since Marcus's departure. Major clients had renewed contracts, reassured by David's promises of stability and renewed focus. Industry analysts praised David's decisive leadership in handling the crisis. Everything was going according to David's plan, except for small cracks that only Marcus could see. The European acquisition was moving slower than expected. Hans Müller's team was asking questions that made David uncomfortable. They wanted to meet former business partners, review historical financials, and understand the company culture. David's answers were smooth and confident, but each delay frustrated him. He had expected the deal to close within 3 months, but now it was looking like 6 or longer. Marcus monitored these developments through his network of contacts. He had been careful never to directly sabotage the deal, but his conversation with Hans had triggered a more thorough investigation. David didn't know who to blame for the complications. It simply seemed like typical bureaucratic delays, but the timing was eating into his plans. Meanwhile, Marcus had been working on something more subtle. He had identified 3 key employees at Richardson Technologies who were crucial to the company's operations. These were people David had overlooked, middle management engineers and project leads who actually made the software work. David was too focused on high-level deals and investor relations to notice their importance. Marcus reached out to each of them carefully, using encrypted messages and burner phones. He didn't ask them to sabotage anything. He didn't even mention David. Instead, he talked to them about their careers, their frustrations, their ambitions. He learned that David had promised them stock options and bonuses that never materialized. He discovered that David had taken credit for their innovations in board meetings. He found that they were quietly looking for other opportunities because they felt undervalued. Marcus made introductions. He connected them with recruiters at competing companies. He provided references that highlighted their skills. Within 2 months, all 3 had received offers elsewhere. They gave their notice within the same week, creating a sudden crisis in Richardson Technologies' technical leadership. Projects were delayed. Client implementations hit problems. The smooth operation Marcus had built began showing stress fractures without him, and without the key people who understood the underlying architecture. David scrambled to replace them, but finding people with their specific knowledge took time. He had to promote inexperienced team members and hire expensive consultants. The company's operational costs increased while project timelines extended. Investors started asking questions about execution capabilities. David blamed it on market conditions and normal employee turnover, but the timing was suspicious to anyone paying attention. During this period, Marcus also cultivated his relationship with James Morrison, the board member who had visited him. They met occasionally for coffee, always in quiet places far from the company's offices. Marcus never directly criticized David. Instead, he asked James thoughtful questions about board governance, fiduciary responsibility, and due diligence. He mentioned, almost casually, that he was still trying to understand what had happened, and that some of the financial records didn't quite make sense to him. "What do you mean?" James asked during one of their meetings. "I'm probably wrong," Marcus said carefully, "but some of the dates on the documents the board received don't match the actual transaction dates in the banking records. It's subtle, probably just administrative errors, but it made me wonder if anyone actually verified the timeline of events independently." James's expression changed. He was an accountant by training, and discrepancies in financial records bothered him deeply. "Are you saying the evidence was fabricated?" "I'm saying I don't know," Marcus replied. "I was fired so quickly I never got a chance to actually see all the evidence against me. I just wondered if the board had done a forensic audit or relied on documents provided by David." This conversation planted a seed that would grow into something larger. James began quietly reviewing the materials the board had received. He started noticing things he had missed in the rush to make a decision. The evidence had seemed overwhelming at the time, but looking back with fresh eyes and Marcus's gentle guidance, inconsistencies emerged. James didn't tell Marcus what he found, but Marcus could see the doubt growing. 4 months after his firing, Marcus executed his next strategic move. He had discovered through his research that David had been using company funds to maintain a lifestyle beyond even his considerable means. There were luxury car leases in the company name, private jet rentals charged as business expenses, and high-end restaurant bills labeled as client entertainment but involving no actual clients. These weren't technically illegal, but they showed a pattern of treating the company as a personal piggy bank. Marcus didn't leak this information directly. Instead, he ensured that a financial journalist who specialized in corporate governance received an anonymous tip about Richardson Technologies' expense policies. The journalist, Sarah Thompson, was known for her thorough investigations and her unwillingness to run stories without solid evidence. The tip she received included specific dates and amounts that she could verify through public records and industry sources. Sarah began investigating. She made calls, reviewed filings, and talked to former employees. She didn't contact Marcus because he wasn't publicly part of the story. But her investigation revealed a pattern of expenses that raised questions about management practices at Richardson Technologies. When she reached out to David for comment, he dismissed her concerns as a routine matter and insisted all expenses were legitimate business costs. The article ran in a major business publication 3 weeks later. It wasn't devastating, but it was embarrassing. Investors read about private jets and expensive dinners. Board members saw their company portrayed as having loose financial controls. The stock price didn't crash, but it dipped. David was forced to issue a statement about implementing stronger expense policies and conducting an internal review. It was a small wound, but wounds could become infected if not properly treated. Marcus watched from his apartment as David made his first major mistake in response. Feeling defensive and attacked, David overreacted. He fired the CFO who had overseen the expense reports, even though the CFO had actually raised concerns about some of David's spending. David claimed he was implementing accountability and improving controls, but to the CFO and others who knew the truth, it looked like David was eliminating someone who knew too much. The fired CFO, Linda Park, was a respected financial executive with 30 years of experience. She had joined Richardson Chen Technologies because she believed in the company's mission and respected Marcus's technical vision. David had kept her after Marcus's departure because she was competent and well-regarded, but he had always treated her with dismissive condescension. Now, fired publicly as a scapegoat, Linda was angry and willing to talk. Marcus reached out to Linda through a mutual contact. They met at a small restaurant where they wouldn't be recognized. Linda was bitter and hurt, but she was also careful. She knew that violating confidentiality agreements could cost her career. "I'm not asking you to breach any agreements," Marcus told her, "but I am curious about something. When you reviewed the evidence against me, did you actually audit the source documents, or did you only see summaries prepared by David's office?" Linda looked at him carefully. "I saw what the board saw. Summaries, highlighted transactions, email excerpts. When I asked to review the underlying bank statements and original contracts, I was told they were being held by external investigators and that board members would have access through a secure portal. But when I tried to access that portal later, my credentials had been revoked." "Do you still have access to any of the summary documents?" Marcus asked. "I kept copies of everything I was given," Linda admitted. "It's standard practice for CFOs. We're legally responsible for financial accuracy, so we keep records." Over the next week, Linda provided Marcus with copies of the documents the board had reviewed. Marcus compared them against the original files Sarah had obtained months earlier. The discrepancies were clear. Dates had been altered. Transaction amounts had been changed. Email timestamps had been manipulated. David had created a convincing forgery, but it was still a forgery, and now Marcus could prove it. But Marcus still didn't act immediately. He had the evidence, he had witnesses, he had documentation. He could go public, call a press conference, hire lawyers, and fight, but he knew that David would have responses prepared. David would claim Marcus had fabricated the evidence. David would attack Marcus's credibility. David would turn it into a he said battle that could drag on for years in courts and public opinion. Instead, Marcus waited for the perfect moment. He continued gathering evidence, adding to his files, strengthening his case. He reached out to more former employees, more business partners who had been wronged by David over the years. He built not just a legal case, but a comprehensive portrait of David's character and methods. 5 months after his firing, the European acquisition finally fell apart. Hans Mueller's company withdrew from negotiations, citing concerns about cultural fit and strategic alignment. These were polite corporate terms that meant they had discovered things they didn't like. David was furious and humiliated. He had promised investors and the board that this acquisition would transform the company. He had based his entire growth strategy on international expansion. Without the European deal, his vision looked hollow. The stock price fell 12% in one day. Board members demanded explanations. Investors questioned David's leadership. For the first time since Marcus's departure, David looked vulnerable. He called emergency board meetings, hired new consultants, and launched an aggressive PR campaign to restore confidence. But the cracks in his armor were showing. Marcus watched all of this unfold with patient satisfaction. He had not caused the acquisition to fail directly, but his conversation with Hans months earlier had set in motion a thorough investigation that revealed truths David couldn't hide. David's pattern of betraying partners, taking sole credit for collaborative work, and prioritizing his ego over actual business relationships had finally caught up with him. But Marcus still waited. He knew that a wounded animal could be more dangerous than a confident one. David would be defensive now, suspicious, looking for threats. Marcus needed David to feel like he was recovering, like he was regaining control. Only then would David's guard truly drop. During this time, Marcus also prepared for his own return. He couldn't come back as a victim seeking justice. He needed to return as a leader offering solutions. He began working on new software concepts, innovations that could rival Richardson Technologies' current products. He registered patents in his own name, developed prototypes, and started sketching out a business plan for a potential competitor company. He also reconnected with key clients he had brought to Richardson Technologies originally. These conversations were careful and subtle. Marcus never badmouthed David or the company. He simply checked in, asked about their business needs, and mentioned he was exploring new opportunities. Several clients expressed interest in what Marcus might develop next. Some even mentioned frustrations with Richardson Technologies' service since Marcus's departure. 6 months after his firing, Marcus was ready. He had evidence that could destroy David completely. He had witnesses willing to testify. He had documentation of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and systematic betrayal. He had a network of allies in place. He had clients interested in working with him. He had new innovations that could disrupt the industry. He had everything he needed to strike back with overwhelming force. But he still waited for the perfect moment, because strategic retaliation isn't about having the weapons. It's about knowing exactly when and how to use them for maximum impact. The perfect moment arrived 7 months after Marcus's firing, and it came from an unexpected direction. Richardson Technologies announced plans for an initial public offering that would value the company at over $2 billion. David had convinced the board that going public would provide the capital needed to pursue aggressive expansion and recover from the failed European acquisition. The IPO roadshow was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks, with major institutional investors lined up to hear David's vision for the company's future. An IPO meant scrutiny. It meant audits, investigations, regulatory reviews, and detailed disclosures. It meant that every aspect of the company's governance, finances, and leadership would be examined by investment banks, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and sophisticated investors. David was confident that his cover-up was solid, that the narrative of Marcus's betrayal was accepted truth, and that no one would question the foundation story of how he had saved the company from a corrupt co-founder. Marcus saw the IPO announcement and smiled for the first time in months. This was the moment he had been waiting for. David had just committed himself to a process that required absolute transparency and credibility. Any scandal, any hint of impropriety, any question about leadership integrity could derail an IPO and destroy billions in potential value. David had positioned himself on the narrowest possible ledge, and Marcus was about to shake the mountain. But Marcus still didn't rush. He spent 2 weeks refining his approach, consulting with Sarah, his attorney sister, and with Linda Park, the fired CFO. Together, they developed a strategy that would be impossible to ignore and devastating in its precision. They would not go to the press first. They would not file lawsuits that David could fight in court. Instead, they would go directly to the entities that mattered most: the investment banks underwriting the IPO and the SEC conducting the regulatory review. Sarah, using her credentials as a corporate attorney, filed a detailed whistleblower complaint with the SEC. The complaint included copies of original financial documents showing the fraud, proof that dates and transactions had been altered, testimony from Linda Park about document manipulation, and a comprehensive timeline of David's takeover strategy. The complaint didn't ask for damages or make emotional appeals. It simply presented facts and requested an investigation into potential securities fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Simultaneously, Marcus arranged for anonymous delivery of similar documentation to the legal departments of the 3 investment banks underwriting the IPO. He didn't threaten or demand anything. He simply provided information that these institutions were legally obligated to investigate as part of their due diligence process. If they proceeded with an IPO while aware of potential fraud and didn't investigate, they could face their own legal liability. The effect was immediate and devastating. The investment banks put the IPO on hold pending investigation. The SEC opened a formal inquiry. Richardson Technologies' board called an emergency meeting. Within 72 hours of Marcus's strategic strike, David's carefully constructed world began to collapse. But Marcus still remained invisible. The whistleblower complaint was filed anonymously through legal channels. The documents sent to investment banks couldn't be traced back to him. David suspected Marcus must be involved somehow, but he had no proof and no way to attack him publicly. For 7 months, David had thought Marcus was broken and defeated, quietly accepting his fate. Now, with the IPO in jeopardy and investigations looming, David realized too late that Marcus had been planning all along. The board demanded explanations from David. James Morrison, armed with the doubts Marcus had carefully cultivated over months of conversations, pushed for an independent forensic audit. Other board members, concerned about their own liability, agreed. David tried to control the narrative, claiming this was a last-ditch attempt by Marcus to sabotage the company out of spite, but his protests sounded defensive and desperate. The forensic auditors worked quickly because they had clear direction about what to examine. The documentation Marcus provided through the SEC gave them a roadmap of exactly where to look. Within 2 weeks, they confirmed that financial documents had been altered, that the fraud investigation that led to Marcus's firing had been based on manipulated evidence, and that David Richardson had systematically deceived the board of directors. The board meeting where these findings were presented was long and bitter. David tried to minimize the findings, claiming technical errors and misunderstandings, but Linda Park, now cooperating fully with investigators, provided detailed testimony about how David had pressured her to present specific versions of financial reports and had blocked her attempts to verify underlying documents. James Morrison presented his own analysis showing the inconsistencies Marcus had gently pointed out months earlier. The vote was unanimous. David Richardson was terminated as CEO and removed from the board of directors immediately. Legal action would be pursued for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. The company issued a public statement, acknowledging serious governance failures, and announced that an interim management team would lead the company while they searched for new leadership. But Marcus's strategy went beyond simply removing David. 3 days after David's termination, Marcus called a press conference at a major hotel in downtown Dallas. It was his first public appearance since his firing 7 months earlier. Journalists filled the room. Cameras lined the walls, and industry analysts crowded into every available seat. Everyone wanted to hear what Marcus Chen had to say. Marcus walked to the podium calmly, dressed in a simple dark suit. Looking thinner but composed, he spoke without notes, his voice steady and measured. He didn't express anger or bitterness. He simply told his story, backed by documentation that Sarah distributed to every journalist in the room. He explained how David had systematically framed him, presented evidence of the altered documents, and described the 7 months he had spent investigating rather than reacting. When David betrayed me 7 months ago, Marcus said, looking directly into the cameras, every instinct told me to fight back immediately, to defend myself, to make noise, to demand justice right away. But my grandfather once taught me that angry reactions are temporary satisfaction, while strategic patience creates lasting change. I chose to wait. I chose to investigate. I chose to build an undeniable case rather than engage in a public battle of accusations. He paused, letting his words sink in. Today, I'm not here to gloat or to celebrate someone's downfall. I'm here to demonstrate something important about business ethics and personal integrity. When you're wronged, when you're betrayed, when you're attacked, the natural reaction is to strike back immediately. But that reaction often makes things worse. It creates chaos, confusion, and endless battles where truth gets lost in the noise. Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. Strategic retaliation isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring that truth prevails and that justice is served. It's about making sure that the guilty party faces real consequences, not just temporary embarrassment. David Richardson didn't just betray me. He betrayed every employee of Richardson Chen Technologies, every investor who trusted us, every client who depended on us, and every principle of honest business practice. His betrayal deserved more than my angry reaction. It deserved systematic exposure and appropriate consequences. The press conference lasted 90 minutes. Marcus answered every question calmly and thoroughly. He provided evidence for every claim. He didn't attack David personally or emotionally. He simply presented facts and let them speak for themselves. By the time he finished, every major news outlet was preparing stories about the biggest corporate fraud case of the year. But Marcus had one more strategic move to make. During the press conference, he announced the formation of a new company, Integrity Systems. He revealed that he had spent the last 7 months not just investigating David's fraud, but also developing next-generation inventory management software that addressed limitations in Richardson Technologies' current offerings. He had filed patents, built prototypes, and secured initial funding from investors who had believed in his innocence all along. More importantly, Marcus announced that 3 major retail clients had already signed letters of intent to work with Integrity Systems. These were clients he had originally brought to Richardson Chen Technologies, clients who had been frustrated with service quality since his departure, clients who had stayed in touch with him during his 7 months of silence. Marcus had been cultivating these relationships carefully, never directly soliciting their business, but making sure they knew he was working on something new and better. The announcement accomplished multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. It demonstrated that Marcus wasn't just a victim seeking vindication. He was a leader moving forward with confidence and innovation. It showed potential investors that he had immediate market traction and client support. It put competitive pressure on Richardson Technologies at its most vulnerable moment. And it proved that strategic patience had allowed Marcus not just to clear his name, but to position himself for even greater success. The following weeks brought rapid changes. The SEC investigation of David Richardson expanded into criminal charges. Federal prosecutors got involved, examining not just the fraud against Marcus, but also David's history of financial manipulations. David hired expensive lawyers and fought the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. His assets were frozen pending the outcome of legal proceedings. Richardson Technologies struggled under interim management. Key employees continued leaving, uncertain about the company's future. Clients began exploring alternatives, including Integrity Systems. The company's value plummeted, and several board members faced shareholder lawsuits for failing in their oversight responsibilities. The damage David had done to the company proved to be far worse than anyone had realized. James Morrison reached out to Marcus privately and apologized for not believing him initially. "You had every right to be angry with me," James said. "I voted to fire you based on David's manipulated evidence, but you never held that against me. Instead, you helped me see the truth through patient conversation and gentle guidance." Marcus nodded. "You did what you thought was right with the information you had. My anger wouldn't have changed your mind. Patient honesty did. That's the lesson my grandfather taught me. Rage feels powerful, but wisdom wins wars." 8 months after his firing, Marcus stood in the first office of Integrity Systems, a modest space with room to grow. His team consisted of the 3 key engineers who had left Richardson Technologies, along with several new hires who believed in his vision. The company was small, but growing steadily. Investors were interested. Clients were enthusiastic. The future looked promising. Sarah visited him one evening after the first successful product deployment. "You did it," she said, looking around the office. "You took the worst betrayal imaginable and turned it into something better than what you had before. But I have to ask, was it worth it? 7 months of silence, living in that tiny apartment, watching David celebrate while you investigated in secret. Did it really need to be that strategic? If I had reacted immediately, what would have happened? I would have looked guilty and defensive. David would have been prepared with counter-arguments. The board would have seen it as 2 bitter partners fighting, with no clear truth. The evidence would have been disputed, buried in legal proceedings that could have taken years. David might have been damaged, but he wouldn't have been destroyed, and I would have been so consumed with fighting that I wouldn't have had time to build something new." He walked to the window, looking out at the city. "By waiting, by being strategic, I didn't just expose David's fraud. I ensured he faced criminal charges. I protected the company's employees and clients from prolonged uncertainty. I built relationships with board members like James who became allies. I had time to develop new innovations and secure initial clients. I turned a betrayal into a complete transformation. That's the difference between reaction and retaliation. Grandfather would be proud." "He taught me that the strongest position is the patient one," Marcus replied. "When someone attacks you, they expect you to attack back. They're prepared for that battle. But when you disappear, when you stay silent, when you let them think they've won completely, that's when their guard drops. That's when they make mistakes. That's when you can strike with precision instead of anger." The lesson of Marcus Chen's story spread through business circles quickly. His case became a teaching example in business schools, discussed in corporate governance courses, and referenced in leadership seminars. But the real lesson wasn't about business tactics or legal strategies. It was about something more fundamental to human nature: the difference between emotional reaction and strategic thinking. Machiavelli wrote in The Prince that it is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. But he also wrote something less famous but more important: the wise man does at once what the fool does finally. Marcus understood that immediate reaction feels satisfying but rarely produces optimal results. Strategic patience, on the other hand, allows you to see the complete battlefield, understand your opponent's weaknesses, and strike when victory is certain rather than merely possible. A year after his firing, Marcus received an unexpected letter. It was from David Richardson, written from federal prison where he was serving a 6-year sentence for fraud and related charges. The letter was surprisingly humble, without the arrogance that had characterized David's personality. He wrote that he had spent months reflecting on his choices and recognized the depth of his betrayal. He acknowledged that Marcus's strategic response had been more devastating than any immediate reaction could have been. "You could have destroyed me with angry accusations," David wrote. "Instead, you destroyed me with patient truth. I underestimated you because I thought silence meant defeat. I now understand that silence was strategy. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that your approach taught me something about strength that I had never understood. Real power isn't in the immediate strike, it's in the strategic position." Marcus read the letter once and filed it away. He felt no satisfaction in David's imprisonment, no joy in his former partner's downfall. He had achieved what he needed to achieve: vindication, justice, and the opportunity to build something better. The rest was simply consequence, the natural outcome of choices David had made. Integrity Systems continued to grow. Within 2 years, it surpassed Richardson Technologies in market share for retail inventory management software. Marcus took the company public successfully, the IPO that David had dreamed of but never achieved. The company's values were built on integrity, transparency, and collaborative innovation. Everything David's approach had lacked. Marcus remained true to the lessons he had learned. When competitors emerged, he didn't react with aggression or fear. He responded strategically, improving his products, serving his clients better, and building sustainable advantages. When employees made mistakes, he didn't react with anger, but investigated root causes and implemented systems to prevent future problems. When opportunities arose, he didn't jump immediately, but analyzed them carefully to ensure they aligned with long-term vision. Years later, Marcus was invited to give a commencement speech at his old business school. He talked about his experience, about betrayal and strategic patience, about the difference between reaction and retaliation. His message resonated with graduates preparing to enter a competitive world where they would inevitably face conflicts and challenges. "The most important lesson I learned," Marcus told the graduates, "is that your first instinct when wronged is usually your worst option. Anger feels powerful in the moment, but it rarely produces lasting results. When someone betrays you, strikes at you, tries to destroy you, pause, breathe, think. Understand that this is not just a moment to survive, but an opportunity to transform." Strategic retaliation isn't about getting even. It's about getting ahead. It's about turning your opponent's aggression into your advantage. It's about making sure that when the dust settles, you're not just vindicated but elevated. He concluded with his grandfather's wisdom, the words that had guided him through the darkest period of his life. Never react with emotion when you can retaliate with strategy. Never strike back in anger when you can strike forward with purpose. And never forget that the person who controls their response controls the outcome. In business and in life, patience isn't weakness. It's the ultimate power move. Marcus Chen's story became legendary not because he defeated an enemy, but because he demonstrated that the path to true victory lies not in immediate reaction, but in strategic patience. He proved that Machiavelli's rule, never react, always retaliate strategically, wasn't just ancient political theory but a practical philosophy for modern success. And most importantly, he showed that when you trade immediate satisfaction for long-term strategy, you don't just win battles, you transform wars into triumphs.